space with you, and that you're sharing this space with me. I think most of you are in the US, so good morning to all of you, and good afternoon to me here in London. My name is Pavel Kuchar. I work at the Department of Political Economy at King's College here in London, and I think I got the invitation to participate in this space and talk a little bit about the ideas that me and my co-author Win Decker put together in a book that recently came out, which has the same title as the presentation that you see in front of yourselves, governing markets as knowledge commons. And this is not going to be a presentation about the book. I'm not going to give you a lecture about what the ideas in the book are, but there are some, because the book is not about Web3, there is a chapter about blockchain, but basically the book is about the big question of where do markets come from, and what are the intellectual, legal and social infrastructures that underpin them, and how we can think about the demand and, most importantly, the supply of these and maintenance of these intellectual and legal infrastructures. And so what we say, and what is the underlying point in this talk really, is the idea that it is really fruitful for us to consider thinking of markets as a kind of a knowledge commons. And the proposal that I like to invite you to consider for a moment here is to think about markets as knowledge commons, because then we're going to get some maybe novel or different ideas about how to govern them better. So again, me being in a role here as a knowledge steward, I come from the background with a sort of a superficial knowledge of Web3. I do have some basic user knowledge of it, and I think most people here in the room are really much more advanced practitioners, innovators in that space. So just bear with me here. I understand that many of you can have your own project, your own sort of problem that you're thinking about, and I would like to present and give you some concepts, some sort of analytical, theoretical tools or frameworks, ideas that hopefully, if you keep track of or consider them, can then help us generate some kind of a discussion and generate questions, and see where we can take this kind of a conversation. So again, when we talk about markets, this is a photo of the old Spittle Fields market here in London, and it's a covered market. It's been there for about 350 years, and probably nothing really changed all that much over those 3 to 4 centuries. It's a place where people can buy and sell. There are some shops and stalls. Now they have antiques, so maybe there are some things that have been there for a long time, and now they became cool and chic. You can buy some food, drinks. So this is what we very often have in mind when we talk about markets. People come together, they exchange things, they try to make each other better off, and it's a very simple idea of how we can think about markets. Here, the question for us really is, how do markets look like in the Web3 world? So is there really some profound change in how we structure our interactions in markets where we exchange the property rights that we have by way of contracts, or is this just a new interface through which we're basically going to be continuing doing the same thing as we've been doing for centuries now? So I do not really know the answer to this. I think no one really does, but I think the common enterprise that we have here together is really trying to figure out together what is it that the new tools that we have are actually potentially useful for. So, if we look at some of the things that people have considered buying and selling in the Web3 space, that everyone sort of knows about, even if we're not involved in it, or even if we're not participating, taking part, or innovating, is of course the Bored Ape collection of tokens. We now have some 10,000 Bored Apes, unique digital collectibles. They live on Ethereum blockchain. And the question is that really something which is qualitatively different from what happens if you go to the old Spittlefields market and buy yourself maybe a painting that you can hang on the wall? Or is this really some kind of an experimentation that can show us the way through development of art, development of new creative ways of expression? What is it that tokens can actually be good for? What is it that they could be used for? If we think about the sort of progression from Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, then we would probably say that the Bored Ape belongs to the Web 3 space. We usually talk about it as a kind of a decentralized and permissionless and cryptocurrency or native payment-based trustless space. Very often people are thinking of sort of getting rid of the middleman, connecting directly to the artist. Some of the main features really have to do with ownership of some of these digital assets, like the one that we're looking at. Can be very useful for people who are, for instance, taking part in digital photography, because it opens the door for people who don't have access to agencies that can support them, take them on. We are thinking of bypassing censorship resistance, or if you're sharing your work, sharing your art on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, we have algorithms that can maybe sort of sideline you. You're being effectively censored. We're thinking of the development of decentralized autonomous organizations. Maybe also we're thinking of possible ways of generating, storing, and presenting different aspects of our identity in a way which is independent of state governments that we maybe not are that maybe we don't trust all that much. So all these are some elements of the Web3 space. If we can think of some other elements of what is it happening that we find on the internet, regardless of whether we're talking about Web 3 or Web 2, because it's quite questionable whether looking at these big companies, corporations like Amazon or Facebook, whether what they're doing really is an element of Web 3 or Web 2. The way how a law professor from Columbia University recently talked about the impact of Facebook and Amazon is that there is this sort of a new epoch of the rule by data, which really is the end of markets as we know them. And in this epoch, data is really a source. And in their process variant, we can think of data as being a kind of a means of governance that is likely to replace both markets as we know them and the law that underpins these markets. So here, data that we might be exchanging in a way like before I showed you exchanging pixels, kind of data here, when we think about how Amazon and Facebook operate, is not really an object of transactions, but rather you can think of it as a kind of an object of governance, as a tool of governing other people on a scale that sometimes even may rival the impact, the scale of nation states. And so that's really a fitting way of think about the importance or not importance of law, and the importance of law for the legal construction of markets. And the argument that Katharina Pistorius is presenting here, that it well may be the case that even if, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, law, rules of property and contract do constitute markets, markets might not really be the only way of organizing economic relationships. And the alternatives that we've experimented with in the last, let's say, 100 years, planning under socialism, has been tried, questionable results, ultimately not really viable. But the other alternative here could be the rise of big tech companies and the accumulation of the vast amount of data that offers another possibility of structuring markets, which is really rule by data. It might be that different Web3 initiatives are really the effort of escaping this sort of a domination, and build, as the quote goes, the internet, which is owned by the builders and users rather than big corporations like Amazon and Facebook. So all this, I think, is to be seen, and I'm really glad and grateful that we can have these conversations, trying to figure out these questions together here. So I talked about the fact that I'm going to give you some peek or talk a little bit into some concepts that might be useful for structuring our thinking about some of these questions that I brought up. Where is it that markets come from? How are they established? Um, what are the intellectual and legal infrastructures that are necessary to sustain and support them? And what has Web3, what the new kind of technology of relating to one another, what does that have to do with it? So why should we talk about the commons in this situation, in this context that I've outlined? Um, well, here's the outline of my talk, and hopefully it will become clear whether talking about the commons and governing the commons is justified and fruitful. And I hope you tell me if this is something that brings some insight for you, or whether you think this is really somewhat of a wasted opportunity. And we should not be really talking about commons when we think about the impact of Web3 on structuring the markets. But um, let's see. Let's hang in there. I'm going to go really through the story of the tragedy of the commons that some of you might know. Um, Outline some basic principles of governance that we've learned out of several decades of studying the existence or alleged or possible existence or non-existence of the tragedy of the commons. Then I'm going to extend these basic principles of governance by talking about knowledge commons, which brings us really closer to the topic of these three sessions that are running in parallel. Decentralized knowledge, how do we put it together in a meaningful way? Knowledge commons, what does it mean? What does it entail? What can we learn from it? And then maybe sort of open-ended invitation to discuss whether it is helpful to think of markets as knowledge commons and whether Web3 can be an environment within which we can fruitfully think about that. So some historical background on the debate on governing the commons. What are the basic principles of governance? How are knowledge commons different? And does it make sense to think of markets as knowledge commons? Hopefully, let's say in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be able to cover these things and maybe generate some insight. So, tragedy of the commons. Most of you, I'm sure, heard about the name of Garrett Hardin, who in 1968 published his really famous seminal article. The idea of the commons, the tragedy of the commons, has not really been coined by Hardin at the end of the 60s, but this goes back to the 19th century. But we're basically talking here about a kind of a social dilemma in which self-interested individuals acting independently deplete a common resource and hence lowering the payoffs of all who participate. So we can talk about atmosphere, oceans, rivers, fish stocks, water management in California, irrigation systems in Nepal, fisheries, rainforest management, but also you can think of mundane things like the office refrigerator, or if you're sharing a house, then maybe your kitchen sink, or any of those things that present social dilemmas where people sort of following whatever they're interested in are generating outcomes that are maybe not so good for the community. So when we think of the tragedy of commons, we typically have in mind a type of property that is neither private nor public. It's rather held jointly by the members of the community, and these members of the community typically govern access and use social structures, traditions, or formal rules to structure the governance, maybe in the absence of the government, the state, enforcing rules of property. So this really is a profound problem of political philosophy, and articulating solutions to this kind of a tragedy of commons has been the main problem of political philosophy over eons. And one solution that Hardin proposed really was to convert the resource into private property, establishing ownership and giving the owner an incentive to enforce, exclude users, and enforce the mode of governance that will lead to sustainable use of this resource. The other, and Hardin preferred this solution, would really be the strict management of the common pool resource or these common goods via increased government involvement, maybe increased involvement of international regulatory bodies, essentially bolstering the importance of public property. You might hear me using the concepts of common pool resource and commons governance, and it is important to distinguish those two. I'll be talking about that a little bit more, but there is one important distinction between commons governance, which is a mode of governing the resources, and a common pool resource, which is one specific type of a resource that I'm going to describe in a moment with a bit more detail. Formally, how can we think of a social dilemma that I've just been talking about? Some of you have maybe studied game theory. We're looking at a very simple model here. We have a situation, it's a social dilemma. We have two players. You can think of a player two as maybe yourself, and you can think of player one of someone else who is maybe sharing the office refrigerator with you, or maybe it's everyone else also. It can be just the rest of the society. And what you're really thinking about is how should you act in different kinds of possible situations that you can imagine. So you as a player can imagine yourself in one of these two nodes, depending on whether everyone else or player one is going to use the refrigerator in a nice and considerate way and leave it nice and tidy for you, in which case you find yourself on the left-hand side, or whether they're really not going to pay all that much attention to the shared resource. So on the left-hand side, we have cooperate. On the right-hand side, we have defect. You can expect that you find yourself in two of these possible situations, and you can make a decision for you whether using this kind of a resource, you are yourself going to be considerate and cooperate, or whether you yourself are going to defect. Your decision making is driven by the expected payoffs. So what do I get from acting nice or not being all that considerate? And these are represented by the numbers that we see in the second line. So in a situation where you think that someone might really be considerate in using the resource, you are thinking of defecting or cooperating, and it is less painful not to be considerate. It just doesn't require all that much effort in constraining yourself. You get a higher payoff if you defect. So that's going to be the strategy that you will want to play on the left node. In the right node, you're comparing a possible payoff of defecting, which is higher than the possible payoff of cooperating, which is -1. Here you'll find yourself in a situation where you're the sucker who cooperates with someone or with the whole world that lets you down. So you're the only person who's keeping the refrigerator tidy or not overfishing, and everyone else is. You really don't want to be finding yourself in that situation. So what we find here, technically speaking, is what is called the dominant strategy. And under any state of the world in this model, Garrett Hardin said, it just doesn't pay for you to cooperate in any type of situation. Now, if you're player one, you know that this is the case for everyone else in the world. And so you know that always on the second node, you will find yourself choosing between defecting and getting a payoff 0, or cooperating and getting a payoff -1. You will defect, and we find ourselves in this undesirable equilibrium where no one cooperates. And that was really the story that Garrett Hardin was telling in the famous article. We are forever really locked into this very bleak world where if we use the backward induction solving this model, as we just did right now, we are doomed not to cooperate. what Elinor Rostrom, looking at this bleak prediction, and so for Garrett Hardin, really the way out of this problem was either privatize, exclude everyone, set up a private business, set up a private firm, set up a private organization, let them handle the resource in a way which is going to be sustainable, which they're likely to if they're going to be driven by maximizing their profits. Garrett Hardin thought the even more secure way of not depleting our resources, our common pool resources, really is to nationalize and set up some kind of a public property. Elinor Ostrom, which you can see on the right-hand side, was the first woman who, in the 2009, got a Nobel Prize in economics. And she actually went on to empirically research whether Garrett Hardin's prediction would hold in the real world. So she actually went into the real world, and she would study the community governance of all these common pool resources that are supposed to be depleted in the inability of people to get together, cooperate, communicate, and alter the dilemma, extricate themselves from the prisoner's dilemma. And she found that Garrett Hardin's prediction is actually not really that robust when we're looking at the real world outcomes, the real world examples of how governance works. So what she came up with, and these are concepts that I would like you to pay some attention to, because the question here is, can we really learn something from these concepts, from these design principles, and take them out from the governance of common pool resources in, let's say, the natural world, aquifers, rainforests, etc. The 8 design principles that Elinor Ostrom found are usually in place when people manage to extricate themselves from the tragedy of the commons that Hardin predicted, are first, clearly defined boundaries. So we need to know who is in, who is out, who are the people residing in a particular community. These people may be held together by complex rituals, complex system of beliefs. We need to know what is the boundary of the resource system, as well as the individuals or households that have the right to harvest resource units from this system. They need to be clearly defined. And if this happens, communities are more likely to address and tackle free riding, as I sort of describe it in the model. So if a group of users can determine their own membership, those who agree to use the resource according to the agreed upon rules, and excluding those who do not agree, then this group has really made an important step towards limiting access and overuse, depletion, generating greater trust and reciprocity. First important finding. The second important design principle, proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. That's basically saying how much, when, and how different products are to be harvested. When we have some rules about the distribution of benefits, and when these rules are made broadly consistent with the distribution of costs that the participants contribute to the maintenance of the common pool resource, then we observe that participants are more willing to pitch in and keep the resource well maintained and sustainable. Think of your office refrigerator, right? So if some users get all the benefits and pay a few of the costs, then others are really not all that likely to follow the rules over time. So that's the second design principle. Now, third, what are the collective choice arrangements in place? Here, what we say is really important is that most of the individuals who are affected by a resource regime, a kind of a governance resource regime, they should be authorized to participate and make and modify their rules. As the environment changes over time, it is really important, it's crucial to be able to craft local rules Because often if you're regulated from the outside, maybe you are somewhere in the countryside, if you're regulated by some kind of an official in a capital, maybe the sort of local information, the local intimate knowledge of the nature of the resource, maybe it's an aquifer, kind of a field irrigation system, maybe it's necessary to be tied to the place. And if you don't really have the autonomy and the ability to make and tailor rules to local circumstances, then the rules that govern the use of the resource might not be considered fair. Monitoring. It is really quite obvious that the rules of cooperation sometimes must be enforced in some manner to achieve robust governance. And while many agree that enforcement of rules is necessary, there is really a vigorous debate about who should be the monitor, who should be enforcing the rules. So most long surviving resource regimes are selecting their own monitors, their own enforcers, but you can also hire someone who is coming from the outside. Usually what happens is that the community creates some kind of an official positions. In some communities, the appropriators rotate into that position, so everyone has some kind of a duty to be a monitor at one point or the other. The last one, which is really the key of the 5 key design principles, there are 3 other supplementary ones, but these 5 are really key, is that we need to have also some kind of a system of graduated sanctions. That means that your sanctions must not really be ridiculously punitive when the first transgression happens. Usually, when you break the rule for the first time, you get a little, slap on the wrist, or maybe not even that. The first sanction imposed by the local monitor has to be low, as to have impact on the expected benefit cost ratio of breaking the local rules. People maybe sometimes don't really know what the rules are. Maybe we're trying to figure them out. And so the initial sanction has to be considered more as a kind of an information to the person who is caught, quote unquote, but also to other people in the community to note this is a boundary that we don't really want to cross. If we have repeated rule breaking, then the sanctions, they have to be enforced in a more strict and ruthless fashion. So in a regime that uses graduated punishments, a person who's really purposely or by error, but repeatedly breaking the rules, it is really a threat to the functioning of the community and the community governance if these transgressions are not punished. So these are 5 really important staple elements and design principles when communities trying to extricate themselves from the prisoner dilemma have to succeed, and many of them typically do succeed. It's not always the case, but if we summarize the argument to this point, we can say that when the users of a resource design their own rules, 3rd design principle, these rules should be enforced by local users or by users accountable to them. Number 4, we should be using graduated sanctions. 5, and these sanctions should clearly define who has the right to withdraw from a well-defined resource and effectively assign cost proportionate to benefits. So if this happens, then we have reinforcing a manner in which collective action and monitoring problems tend to be resolved. The 3 remaining ones, important as well. There needs to be some kind of a conflict resolution mechanism in place. So when we get to talking about Web3, forking the code, maybe there is a conflict that hasn't been resolved. We can fork indefinitely, but then the resource that we're actually all sharing is probably diminishing in usefulness if everyone has their own code and all of these codes are incompatible. So here, conflict resolution mechanisms. It's important for rules to be understood by the participants to be effective. And by devising or designing or coming up with simple local mechanisms to get conflicts aired immediately and resolutions that are generated in the community and generally know in the community, it is generally the case, as Aino Rostrom observed, that the number of conflicts is reduced and trust increases. There needs to be a minimal recognition of the right to organize. So if you're a community that exists within some kind of a national territory, maybe a national or local government has to tolerate what you do, or at least not explicitly punish your right to self-organize yourself. Some resource systems have operated for relatively long times without such specifically defined or specified, formally written down rights or rules. One example is a remarkable system of a set of fisheries in Bengal. Um, these fishermen had no legal rights to fishing. They even called themselves illicit fishers, so you couldn't just bring a conflict to a local judge or call the police when someone is not cooperating with you. You're illicit. You don't exist as far as the legal system is considered. But yet, there is some kind of a system that enforces and motivates cooperation and is enforced locally without any recognition of government officials. So the risk here is that if we have this kind of a system, we might have participants rely almost entirely on unanimity. And that means that when one person or one group within that community becomes disgruntled, maybe even temporarily, they can bring the external authorities to the conflict, to the table, and that might threaten the existence of the regime itself. So these veto rights make local governance system potentially fragile, and at least we have some kind of a conflict resolution mechanism in place. This is how they can sometimes fall apart. Now, if we're dealing, finally, 8th design principle, if we're dealing with common pool resources that are sort of larger than just community-based, then we have to think of a presence of an existence or presence of governance activities that are organized in multiple layers. And we can say there are multiple nested enterprises. So among long-enduring, sustainable, self-governed regimes, the smaller scaled organizations typically would be nested in larger organizations, and that leads to what Elinor Ostrom and people at the Ostrom Workshop in Indiana have been calling systems of polycentric governance. And so I'm not going to go into discussing that, but we can have more, we can chat a bit more if you're interested in what polycentric governance is, what is it good for, how is it different from a monocentric kind of governance, and why is it important when we talk about design principles, what does it have to do with Web3. So we have these design principles. They've been found to be present in robust systems of governance. And I just want to sort of briefly show you the framework for analysis that can also be helpful to structure our thinking about problems that are not really related to the traditional common pool resources, which are sort of natural based. So what is that theoretical framework? I, as an economist, we start really from the premise that people act and interact. They find themselves in different action situations, like the one that you saw, the social dilemma. That's an action situation. And in that action situation, you interact with someone or members of your group, and those interactions generate outcomes. We saw that in the little extended form game. What is important for us to consider when we are interested in what Elinor Ostrom came up with as a form of institutional analysis is that we have to pay attention to what are the relevant material and biophysical condition of the resource that we deal with. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that, but just to highlight the two important elements of this point is that the resources that we can deal with can be divided in a sort of a 2x2 matrix. First, by subtractability of use or rivalry. If I use the pen, you can't use it. The subtractability of use is high. If I drink my cup of tea, it is gone. No one else can use it, and we have high subtractability of use. And there are resources or goods that have low subtractability of goods. So maybe the air that we breathe under certain conditions which are not too restrictive is there for everyone. Maybe there is an idea. If I think the idea, you can also think it. There is nothing really rival in this. The other element, exclude the possibility of excluding potential beneficiaries from using the resource. So this can be high or low. It might be costly or difficult, costly or easy to exclude people from using a resource. And depending where we find ourselves in the matrix, we can talk about private goods where subtractability of use is high and excludability is high. Typically, bread, yogurt, t-shirts, markets deal quite well with those. We can talk about goods where subtractability of use or rivalry is low, and excludability, the cost of exclusion are high. So maybe systems like things like national defense, or sometimes people think of healthcare, right? But the interesting case that Rainer Ostrom studied and that Garrett Hardin gave bleak predictions were in between. So typically when we have high subtractability of use, meaning if everyone sends their cows to the commons, if everyone is sort of sucking out the water from the aquifer, if everyone is pillaging your office refrigerator, well, then that resource is going to be depleted, high subtractability, and high difficulty of excluding potential beneficiaries. You can't stand in front of the refrigerator all day and monitor who is behaving and who's not. Then we're dealing with these common pool resources that are potentially difficult to govern. So this is the first important element that we have to pay attention when we are looking at different situations in which people interact, and when we want to know why is it that they generate outcomes that we'd rather they not generate it. Maybe they don't cooperate. Maybe we have unsustainable management. Secondly, we need to know what are the attributes of relevant communities in question. So what is that? Do people have a common understanding of what is it that they're doing when they're dealing with a common resource? Is there a homogeneity of preferences? What is the size and composition of the community in question? What are the elements of equality or inequality in these communities? All these are really important for us to understand whether people are likely to cooperate or defect in managing a common pool resource or contributing to it. Third, very important element of this analysis, what are the rules in use? And we write rules in use because these are different from the rules that are on paper. Sometimes there are no rules on paper, they're not written, there's no legislation. Sometimes the rules on paper are not respected. Everyone knows that that's a joke, and everyone knows that there are these rules that everyone follows. So when we talk about rules, it is important to consider the shared understandings by participants about what kind of rules are in place and what kind of rules are going to be enforced, what are the actions or outcomes that are required, which actions are prohibited, and which actions are permitted. Important, right? So rules here are the result often of implicit or explicit efforts to achieve order. There's some predictability or need for predictability among humans, and we create different kinds of positions. We can think of identities even. And in these positions with these identities, people are then required or permitted or forbidden to take different classes of actions in relation to or facing the likelihood of being monitored and sanctioned. So markets, right? Who can buy and sell? And what is the just price? Can I resell? What if my goods are faulty? Can I rent out my womb for money to be a gestational carrier? Can I sell my kidney if I want to buy a new iPhone? Can I sell myself into slavery? Right, all these questions are determined jointly when we think about what are the relevant material biophysical condition of the resource that we're dealing with, what are the communities in question, and what rules do they use. When we put all these things together, Elinor Ostrom and the people at the Ostrom workshop came up with this framework which I introduced to you briefly, and it might be helpful for you to sort of visualize how things hang together here. As I said previously, it is, to summarize, basically rules, the biophysical and the material world, the nature and the attributes of the communities all jointly affect the types of actions that individuals can take. So this is where Garrett Hardin said we're all locked into the social prisoner dilemma, and through our interactions, we're only going to generate the bleak outcome of depleting our own resources. Hence, drastic measures have to be taken. Eleanor Ostrom said, well, hold on, how is it that we define the payoffs and the structure of this game? Where does this game come from? Can we and can the communities themselves actually, through their interactions, their criteria of evaluation and the outcomes they generate, in fact, extricate themselves and amend the attributes, the rules, and maybe even sometimes the biophysical and material conditions of the things the resources that they deal with, to change and the outcomes and the patterns of interactions within which they find themselves. So this is really a powerful framework within which the research on the governance of the commons have been undertaken, and it's been this kind of a structure that generated some of the design principles that I showed you. So you might be wondering, why should we bother with all this? Where is this going? Why is this relevant for thinking about markets in the Web3 world? Recall, I want to convince you, or at least let you consider for a moment the idea that markets and the governance of the very infrastructures that underpin markets, on which rules of property and contract run, that these very systems should be thought of as a kind of a commons, and specifically knowledge commons. So it's the idea, the underlying thesis, that markets are knowledge commons, and this is how we should think about them when we consider different ways of governing them. Markets are basically systems of knowledge creation when we think about this. Things like what should be produced, who gets what and how, what are we discover in our market interactions through our exchanges, new practices, new ways of organizing production, distribution. We figure out new combinations of scarce resources, new sort of reconfiguration of rules and capital goods. Markets in this sense are really sort of they're machines of registering changes in our dispersed knowledge, and they signal these changes with different kinds of signposts, and prices are one of those signposts, but also rules and the ways how we interpret these rules are different kinds of signposts through which markets and the rules on which they build basically signal what are the things that we're supposed to be doing when we're buying, selling, transacting. So what kind of resources and inputs are necessary for markets to operate smoothly and give us what we want, produce desirable results? Where do these inputs come from? So when we think about knowledge commons, the idea of commons, and I'm just going to summarize what I was talking about up until now. Commons is a form of community management or governance. We can apply this idea, the idea of commons governance, to resources. It involves a group of people, a community of people, but the idea of commons, the commons governance, does not itself refer to the resource in question, the community in question, or the place in question. It's not a thing. It's a process of governing the resources in relevant communities using different kinds of rules. So commons is an institutional arrangement of these elements. It's a form of governance. It's different from private governance, it's different from public governance. It's kind of an intermediate, community-based, very often non-governmental, non-state governance. Knowledge, very broadly, I told you, I think of markets as sort of mechanism through which knowledge is registered, produced, amended, changed. So knowledge here refers to a broad set of intellectual and cultural resources, and some of these resources actually feed into our functioning of markets. So when we think of knowledge commons, and this is how we define those, that's a shorthand for institutionalized community governance and this is really important, of the sharing and in many cases creation of intellectual and cultural resources. The idea of sharing these intellectual and cultural resources is really important, I think, when we think of markets as knowledge commons, because the idea of sharing is a kind of an underappreciated thing that we don't really register when we look at the old Spittle fields market, as I showed you. You see people competing. I want this. I want to grab this thing for the lowest price possible. I want to get a bargain. And we sort of ignore what are the underlying intellectual and legal infrastructures that we actually have to share for this even to happen in a market as we traditionally know it. So we can understand the demand for governance institutions. It arises from a community's needs to overcome various social dilemmas associated with producing and preserving and sharing these resources. Um, and I think one useful way of sort of illustrating what a typical, or let's say more straightforward, knowledge commons might be, you might well think of a university library, right? And I think we're sort of, this way we're getting a little bit closer to start talking about blockchains or open source software or different elements of Web3. So when we think of the elements of the institutional analysis and development as applies to analysis of knowledge commons, and think of the governance of university libraries as one of those, then consider what are the, let's say, biophysical characteristics of those things that are governed by way of university libraries, right? We have some ideas, they're stored within some artifacts, and these are usually somewhere to be found in different facilities. So this can be a building, maybe there's a limited capacity of the building, maybe the ideas are stored on hard drive or whatever, flash disks, stored somewhere on Dropbox, somewhere else. Ideas, again, non-rival. Maybe sometimes even these ideas, these resources may have network properties, or they can be anti-rival in the sense that the more you use an idea, the more it's available for everyone else. So these are the specific biophysical characteristics that we might deal with in a knowledge commons like university library. What kind of communities, what kind of attributes of communities might be facing, who are the information users, who are the information providers. The users may be people appropriating digital information at any point of time, providers, those who are making the software, hardware, the whole infrastructure available, policymakers, people, voluntary self-governing communities of insiders, could be a library committee, etc. Now, the community may be involved in various aspects of governance, regulation, enforcement, and remember, they might have shared understanding of what is it that they do when they come to when they come to a library. There might be some homogeneity in preference, the size and composition. Again, if you're talking about the university library, might be determined by the size of the university, etc. Right? And when we talk about the rules in use, it is important for us here to consider what we talk about when we talk about property rights, and specifically intellectual property rights. People talk about bundles of rights sometimes when they talk about property rights. So people might have access, the right to enter a physical area or enjoy and subtract benefits. They might have right to contribute to this resource, change it maybe, extract some benefits or some resource units from it, remove one's artifacts from the knowledge commons, manage or participate, different rights to regulate internally use patterns. Do I have a say? How long the library is open? How many books can I borrow? Transform the resource by making improvements. Is it a community-based, self-improving, self-managing library? Exclusion. Who do we exclude? And this is typically taught of property rights. Importantly, property rights give us the right to say no. You don't have access to this. You can't use it. But it's not the only element of property rights. Alienation. Can you sell some of the things? Can you lease? Can you manage? Etc. Right? So these are different elements of property right that we talk about specifically when we talk about intellectual property rights as well. So what kind of knowledge commons can we think about? I mentioned libraries, straightforward. I think we can all sort of imagine how that could work. Open source software, really important when we're thinking of applying intellectual property rights to people excluding other participants from tweaking the code, appropriating it, maybe for commercial purposes. The Apache system of running servers has been wildly successful, and it was based on an open source collaboration. Um, Things like cadastral surveys, records of land ownership, really key for the functioning of markets in land. And that's where blockchains potentially could be very useful or not. Um, and markets, again, as a kind of a knowledge commons where we register changes, where we define different kinds of rules of participating, changing the rules based on which we can exchange, enter into these transactions, etc. So um, looking back at the IAD framework, um, when I talk about the rules in use, which can be really defined, determined, and changed at different levels at which we might operating at on a daily basis, we can have determination of rules going on at collective choice. Maybe that happens in the parliaments, or maybe there's some kind of a village assembly that is maybe then under some kind of a constitution that could be formal or informal. When we think about the rules of markets at the very basic operational level, when we buy and sell in markets, we're typically talking at the minimum about the definition of levels of property and contract. I consider these to be a part of shared knowledge. This kind of knowledge has to be stored somewhere, and we have to have some kind of an understanding of where these rules are coming from, and who is it that can amend them, who can use them, who can apply them to what, etc. So when we go back to the framework that I showed you, we can, I think, already start thinking about the supply side mechanisms through which these diverse repositories of knowledge, libraries, open source software, land ownership records, blockchains, these consist of ideas. Property rights are ideas. Money is a kind of an idea that people believe. And then you can buy stuff because people believe the idea that there is money that has value. We have artifacts. Typically, money comes as a banknote or your cell phone. We usually pay with that these days. Facilities, platforms that serve as repositories of knowledge. How are these produced, provided, reproduced, maintained? And how does that happen outside of the typical public-private? Well, we need the government to fix that. That's not the whole story. Typically, there is not even the government that's capable enough of maintaining and producing these kinds of knowledge that people then can rely on. So what are the relevant communities in questions? What kind of heterogeneity can we find? Shared values, beliefs about do's and don'ts. What are the processes through which the rules of the game are defined, amended, and enforced? And now also take into account the important feedback mechanisms that really points to the fact that these very inputs into the functioning of markets do not come from the outside of the system, but very often are rather produced and reproduced sort of jointly with other outcomes that we typically care about. So I'm sort of bringing this to a wrap up and maybe some open-ended ideas that we can start riffing on. What are some of the things that Web3 can help us rethink if we start considering markets defined as sort of systems of rules of property and contract, produced, shared, and maintained as kind of a knowledge commons? Well, what are some of the elements where Web3 technology, Web3 contributions to systems of governance can help us rethink? Well, think about money, right? Markets might have a character of a barter, in which case there is no money. That's probably how it started a long time ago. But it is, however, the case that now again, throughout history, we observe that usually there is some kind of a problem of mutual coincidence of wants, and there is usually one commodity that everyone wants to have for the sake of being able to exchange it because everyone knows it will be accepted. That's what we typically call money. Could blockchains do away with this? Maybe we don't really need to use these intermediate artifacts such as money, and we can just replace this arcane for someone social institution with a ledger of mutual accounts payable and receivable, right? What are the different kinds of needs that the social institution of money satisfies that can be replaced by blockchain ledgers, and what are some of those that can't? Maybe some kind of an arbitrary management of monetary policies is something that people actually want. And they want to have some kind of an arbitrary government tweaking monetary policies. Maybe putting money on blockchain would actually tie our hands too much. And maybe that's really not what is desirable. We can think about the importance of corporations. Could decentralized autonomous organizations provide an alternative for organizing economic activity through business corporations? Could it be the case that token ownership or that people who acquire tokens could take part in the governance of decentralized autonomous organization in a way that sort of bypasses the problems that we have in corporate governance, which often is unaccountable to its shareholders, or which, on the other hand side, may often follow the needs and desires of its shareholders, creating problems for people who are not involved or not owners of the shares in companies. So here are the important questions that we have to ask: whether shareholders own corporations or whether corporations are really in themselves legal persons that is sort of unowned collective agent that has its own trajectory, its own perpetual life, provides asset shielding for different kinds of enterprises that people are interested in. Is it really desirable here to get rid of a middleman? And in many cases, it might not be. That's something to think about again. The third big thing before I wrap up: property, right? Property rights. What is it that we own when we buy a token? And when we buy digital assets, are these sort of goods, are these assets good for anything beyond video games or gambling? Can we think of expanding the possibility of amateur photographers, so digital photography, art in general, music, or is this just a conspicuous consumption, in which case nothing really changes from the Gilded Age of 100 and something years ago? Importantly here, could blockchain ledgers enable formalization of land ownership in developing countries without states and governments capable of surveying, registering, and protecting land titles? Is this likely to happen in the developing world, or is this likely to happen in the developed world? What is the role of incumbents like notaries, who are typically sort of the frog sitting on the fountain in some of the places where people want to register their titles in order to be able to buy and sell and improve and invest in their land? Could blockchains help with land registers and cadasters, etc.? Importantly here, can blockchains provide dispute resolution mechanisms? What if there are different groups of people, think Afghanistan, who have different ideas about who has genuine legitimate rights to land ownership? Can we resolve these problems on blockchains, or do you need some mechanism outside blockchains, like village informal community governance, or some kind of a formal state governance or state government, which often is not functioning well in sort of war-torn places? So these are some of the questions that I'd like us to consider, given some of the conceptual framework that I worked with and introduced to you, discussing and thinking about what is the future of markets in the Web3 world. And I think this really is a sort of a big question mark. And I hope some of what I said here has been useful, and you will join me in discussing and thinking about these. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I think this is it from me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have an hour-long lunch break now, and then if you'd please join us back, I think we'll be having a little group